Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It has been a while since I have done one of these. Tonight, we're enjoying the company of someone who, up until a couple of years ago, I honestly respected. I went out of my way to help Badmouse when he landed on his face in that debate he had with Sargon. I honestly like the guy. But for whatever reason, he decided he was going to go tanky. And in the process of going tanky, decided that he was going to get very particular about who he associated with, because obviously, if you're interested in a hierarchical regime, you cannot be associated with the wrong people, or I don't know, you might get accused of guilt by association. Kind of a thing that happens, particularly when you're the one doing it to other people all the damn time. But whatever. It has been a while since I've done a political video like this. Christmas and a job hunt left my schedule in a bit of a shambles. But we are back on track now. And tonight, while I have covered the issue of free speech elsewhere, we are actually going to go through a video upon the subject opposing the idea and explain why the person presenting their case is, quite frankly, full of shit.
One day I was helping out at the Free Palestine stall on Church Street. About an hour in, a young dude came up to me and gave us the usual conservative drivel. He told me that he just couldn't support the left anymore, because to him we were all against free speech. Right below me were flyers detailing the extent of Israeli war crimes against Palestinians, and how little the world still hears about their plight.
It's almost like there's a protracted campaign to silence people advocating on the part of the Palestinian people. Imagine that. It's almost as if we don't actually have free speech, and that is a problem for the Palestinians. Go figure. But no, of course not. Why allowing the government to, I don't know, douse your table in gasoline and light it on fire, so you were not able to advocate the existence of Palestinians at all, that of course is the solution. Why didn't I think of that?
He took one look and stated that he just wasn't interested in our campaign, and bid me farewell. For of course, we must always have our standards.
Actually, I'm not completely certain you have any anymore, Badmouse. I'm gonna be honest about that.
My starting point when it comes to the consideration of any issue relating to free speech is my passionate belief that the second most precious thing in life is the right to express yourself freely.
There's never been a more unshakable dogma in my lifetime than that of freedom of speech.
Ahem. Capitalism.
The real test of a country's standards is if it allows people to criticize one another, especially the regime. The foundation of liberty and freedom and fribity is the story of free expression. After all, if you want to know who has the power, just look at the group that you're not allowed to criticize. Right? No. I'm here today to tell you that freedom of speech is not just some base flatline monolith from which all societies are to be held accountable to. It's a political concept, thought up by human beings, subject to critique, and quite frankly, is in great need of one.
Non sequitur. First of all, the fact that something has been thought up by humans does not mean it is or is not subject to critique, nor does it mean that we are not allowed to use it as a standard by which other groups of humans may be measured. Okay? The idea that cannibalism is wrong was thought up by humans. I'm pretty sure you're not going to say we shouldn't judge cannibals. The idea that incest is wrong is thought up by humans. I'm pretty sure you're not going to say we shouldn't make that legal. Pedophilia is a thing entirely thought of by humans. Again, I don't imagine anyone legalizing that any time in the foreseeable future. Furthermore, free speech is by definition subject to critique. Simply because you are critiquing it does not mean your critique is going to be successful, as you are about to amply demonstrate, Badmouse. So yes, we are free to critique free speech. But that does not mean that your critique is going to work nearly as well as you seem to think it will.
Your concept that freedom of speech is good is only possible if your opponent also agrees with you, i.e., they're not going to kill you if you happen to disagree. So therefore, if your opponent doesn't and will use aggression against you, you can't really argue for freedom of speech in that circumstance. Materially, I mean.
There was once a gentleman named Jan Hus who wandered around Germany saying it was really, really bad that the cardinals and bishops had all of this money, that the Pope sat in a chair of gold, bedecked in rings, with a scepter covered in jewels in his hand, that this did not represent the interests and desires of Christ. And for walking around saying this, he was tied to a post, doused in oil, and burned alive. But here's the thing. Because someone wrote down what he said, a movement called the Hussites took shape. And the Hussites seized control of Bavaria and fought to expel the Pope and the cardinals and the bishops. They lost badly. But a century or two later, another man began walking around saying the same thing, because this man had read what Jan Hus had said and agreed with him. Now, in the intervening couple of centuries, there had been multiple dozen attempts by various people who had read what Jan Hus had said and agreed with him. But this time it worked. Because after decades and decades and centuries, the words of Jan Hus had spread far and wide enough that no amount of violence could stop the uprising. Free speech does not exist when it is convenient. It exists when it is not convenient. It is there because an idea cannot be killed. And those conveying the idea, regardless of the impact to them, will, sooner or later, assuming the idea is accurate and correct, effect the changes they wish to have. They may not live to see them. That is always a danger. But if the idea is correct, if it is accurate and true, the change will come. Are you not actually trying to effect meaningful change, Badmouse? Is that what this is about? Let's see later, shall we?
The conditions around you have to be such that no one is going to die.
No, they don't. I literally just explained this to you. They do not have to be that way. In fact, I am going to go even further here. It is precisely when people are going to die that free speech is so important. Because it is at precisely this time that those who have an interest in seeing them dead do not want anyone talking about it.
Right, okay, what are we on now? Okay. Here we go. The Weimar Republic.
Ah, yes, the state doomed to fail before it was conceived, every anti-speech advocate's favorite boogeyman.
Full suffrage, large democracy. Massive instability and debt caused from the prior war, enter the Nazis. And the German Communist Party. Yes, everybody seems to forget, but the commies were there too, headed by one Ernst Thälmann. At their peak, they gained 16% of the vote in 1932. Now, whilst Ernst was forward in his anti-fascism, the Social Democratic Party, and their newspapers, did not seem to understand the idea of a united front. They refused to effectively confront fascism and simultaneously denounced the KDP as being a bunch of Muscovites, sporting the now famous Iron Front symbol. The SPD's failure to effectively confront fascism aided Hitler's rise to power, sent the KDP underground, and Ernst to 11 years in the hole, followed by a firing.
Of all the things you could criticize the SPD for, its moral and intellectual bankruptcy, its obsession with incrementalism and historical progression, the fact that it hired the Friedkorps, the precursor to the Nazi Party, to suppress other communists. You are going to sit here and whine and bitch that if they just punched Nazis harder, there wouldn't have been Nazis. Are you fucking stupid? No nationalist party anywhere has been suppressed by violence. Why? Let me be really blunt here, Badmouse. They're better at it than we are. They are much better at it than we are.
Don't tell me that free speech exists in a vacuum. It doesn't. In this video, we'll talk about the necessary further questions we need to ask on this topic. Who dictates the media? Which views are more profitable? And if the Enlightenment was correct, why did liberalism fail in its mission?
Wow, let's see here. Capitalism, and capitalism. You know, I'm honestly beginning to wonder how much Badmouse has actually read. The failure of liberalism was functionally the failure to recognize the inherent contradictions in the economic system they were advocating. Their political system had few if no problems. Marxists ourselves flatly desire to take the political system advocated by liberals, that is direct or representative democracy, and apply it to workplaces. That's what we want. We have no issue, or ostensibly should have no issue, with the political system liberals came up with. It is the economic system that has all of the problems, and the reason liberalism has landed squarely and obliquely on its face.
The most precious thing in life, I think, is food in your mouth. And the third most precious is a roof over your head. But a fixture for me in the number 2 slot is free expression, just below the need to sustain life itself.
This clip was one of the first main intro points for me, as well as many others, into the realm of super free speech. And it's strange looking back on it just how dated it all is. It's not like we didn't have the arguments back then, but more so, nobody really cared. We were all swept up in the dogma. To challenge free speech would be on the same level as strangling a baby.
The funny part being that if you actually have the arguments, you certainly haven't presented them here. I mean, the point he is functionally making in that statement is that if you are unable to tell someone, I do not have food, I do not have clothing, I do not have a place to live, your situation is going to be infinitely worse in endeavoring to acquire those things than if you have the ability to repeatedly convey to people that you don't have them. And I love the little dagger you threw in there. Super free speech. No, it's not. Declaring you lack basic necessities is not super anything. It is the most pitiable standard. The lowest possible level of speech necessary for society to function.
Anybody can speak about the joys of free speech, but it means absolutely nothing to somebody who has no power with that speech. What, freedom to beg? That's institutionalized sadism. Now, I'm not a believer in some hierarchy of rights, but if I did, this would not go at number 2. This would go at, like, I don't know, some 97. Now, why is it that I say this? Well, in the words of some philosophy dude who people say look a lot like me, no rights matter if you're dead. Food, water, healthcare, housing, these are all things we need in order to survive.
And things you're not going to get if you cannot tell people you do not have them. I don't get how this eludes you. There is a difference between demanding and begging. This is something every activist should clearly understand. There is a very large difference between saying, we demand shelter, food, and clothing, and there will be a revolution if we don't get them, and saying, please, can we have shelter, food, and clothing? Oh, we're not really going to do anything, but we'd really like to have it. Those are completely different statements. Do you not get that those are completely different statements, Badmouse?
And fulfill and enjoy all those other things that we now consider rights. And despite the fact that millions of people around the world end up dying from the lack of these needs, even when they're universally agreed upon, you ever notice how the whole discussion goes very, very quiet?
Mostly because it's difficult to convey your voice across several thousand miles of space. Certainly the discussion is not quiet in India, nor is it quiet in Africa, nor is it quiet, I believe, in Venezuela. It's gotten quite loud in Venezuela. It is not quiet in Brazil. It is not quiet in Mexico. It is not quiet in South Chicago. It is not quiet in East St. Louis. It is a very loud and noisy discussion. If it sounds quiet to you, it is because you are at great distance from where the discussion is occurring, Badmouse. And that is not the fault of the people having the discussion, I assure you.
As you can see, the number of people sleeping rough has doubled in 5 years. And unfortunately, at the moment, the only people trying to address it are the goddamn socialists. No one cares apart from the socialists. The problem with Marxists is they're the only people in bourgeois societies who actually care about the poor. They're the only people actually trying to talk to them.
Oh, look. Someone who is participating in the discussion. Isn't that amazing, Badmouse? It's almost like this discussion is occurring without you.
I wonder why the left seems to be, on the whole, largely committed to these causes. It's something that you find scantily addressed by the middle to right spheres, with the exception of private individual charity. And Cal may find himself wondering why it is that these ideologies can barely create a solid solidarity towards these topics. You may be a liberal and say, yeah, I support that too.
And I'm saying this as someone who always gives money to homeless people. I am very sympathetic to the plight of people on the streets.
But the effects and actions are what counts.
You mean his action of giving money to people in the street? Fucking A, Badmouse. Do you even bother listening to your video before you post it, or you just sit there rambling in a voice and no clue what the hell you just said? The answers here are obvious. First of all, the conservative movement, at least in the United States, is nothing but a gang of monarchists. They earnestly desire a return to a time when those magically blessed by God ruled without question or hindrance. So arguing the conservatives don't really care about poor people is kind of an duh thing. The center is just that. They're people who don't want to care about anything. They don't want to be left. They don't want to be right. They don't want to notice the issues. They want to pay their taxes on April the 15th and go buy their Ford Mustang. So again, expecting them to care about anything at all is completely ridiculous and unreasonable, and that's why we need speech to explain to them why these issues are important and will, on the long term, negatively impact them. You're not making an anti-speech argument here, Badmouse. You just made a pro-speech argument.
Fact of the matter is, there's no confidence here. I see no outpouring of condemnation coming from you when politicians like Bolsonaro press forward their restrictive measures, unlike what you had to say for this powerless redhead. Why is that? Count Dankula, otherwise known as Mark, who interestingly I had a couple of scuffles with a while back without realising it, taught his dog to do the Hitler salute, and he got fined £800. Now, that's probably one of the most petty excuses for a sentencing, I'll admit, but again, this is not about whether or not it's justified, it's about people's standards.
Your standards have no relation to whether or not something is Okay, at this point I am completely certain Badmouse is not listening to what is coming out of his own mouth. Badmouse, your standards have everything to do with whether or not something is justified. Your standards determine whether you hold it is true or not, whether the thing in question is justified or not, whether it is worth getting upset about or not. That is determined by your standards. Seriously, listen to your video before you put it on your page.
During and after the sentencing, Mark received enormous support from, well, everyone. And now he's more famous than he ever previously was. Enough to be at the forefront of the Free Speech Festival later that year, and even use his fame to help push forward the re-emergence of UKIP. This is attention that people would pay top dollar for. Way more than 800 quid. If I was him, I'd be proud that I got that court hearing. Not disappointed. Frankly, me and my colleagues who I was with at the time didn't really care about this whole thing that much. What happened around the same time that did catch some of our attention, however, was the plight of the J20 protesters who got arrested back during Trump's inauguration. Some of these people are currently on the butcher's list to serve 60-year sentences for standing against a president who's, well, a dick.
I hung out with Black Bloc briefly when I was in college. And any time you did a protest with them, the first thing the organizer would ask is, anyone who is comfortable getting arrested, raise your hand. Anyone going into an action like that expects to be arrested, expects to go to prison. That's what you go there for. That's what they ask you when you show up. That's what you say, yep, I'm here to do that. But all of this is an aside. The fact that a group of people consider Count Dankula's sentence ridiculous and absurd, and do not consider the J20 protesters ridiculous and absurd, when Count Dankula did not raise his hand and go, yeah, right here, I'd like to get arrested, please. And I guarantee you, every last one of those J20 protesters raised their hand and went, yeah, I'm here to get arrested. I've been in that group. I know how they operate. Nobody walked in there without expecting to end up in prison. And the fact that some people find one reasonable and the other absurd is not an argument against speech.
I mean, yes, I know the liberal opposition is fucking corny as hell, but he's still a dick. They've all been dicks. He's just continuing the line that every dick who ever stood on center stage ever started. This is America. What, you think Bernie's gonna save you? You think that reforming the Democrats is ever gonna change the nature of the #1 imperialist power?
Do you seriously believe you're going to oppose the #1 imperialist power? when you're not allowed to say anything against them?
Apologies. If you are at all concerned that I didn't really give much of a toss about Mark's pug joke, don't worry. If you have ever had friends like him, like I have in the past, you'd know that this stuff isn't too surprising. I know that these are highly political times, but a guy who votes UKIP is not particularly my number one concern right now.
Well, at least you have your head straight on that issue. I hear a butt coming up. Let's hear the butt, shall we?
Now, I didn't happen to give a toss, but I sure as hell know somebody who did. Mike Studbury, who you'll remember from his childish Twitter ramblings and dealings with Watson. He proclaimed that the left needs to stand with free speech, a free speech which is largely at the teat of right-leaning discourse.
Question. How? How is free speech benefiting one side over the other side when all you have to do is simply present a better case? Are you saying the entirety of the radical left is incapable of presenting a good case? Or simply that you, Badmouse, are incapable of presenting a good case? I suspect it might be the latter, sir.
Carl, who was there with him, earlier that year got deplatformed by lefty liberals in his debate with Muke. The dogma is enforcing itself here. The left is supposed to throw up our hands and switch liqueur of which virtue engenders the floor, and decide whether or not we should allow freedom of speech for our enemies, or not allow it. When what we should be doing is taking control of the narrative, putting forward our views as the new talking point of discussion instead of a fucking Nazi pug.
Hey, what gives you the right to control the narrative?
That's a good question. Hegemonic propaganda of our status quo is already enforcing the narrative. Noam Chomsky.
Yes, ladies and gentlemen, if we do not whip the slaves, the plantation owners will whip the slaves. And if we don't want the plantation owners whipping the slaves, we just have to whip them ourselves. Or we could abolish whippings and slavery. That's another option, Badmouse. You have completely avoided the actual question here. Why should anyone be permitted to control the narrative? Simply because the other side is already controlling it is no more justification for our seizing control of it than plantation owners whipping slaves is justification that we should be whipping them instead. This is called a false dichotomy. It is also called begging the question. And it is precisely because you are committing these errors that free speech is necessary to point out the fact that you are committing these errors.
Yeah. Thought as much. I need to find a way to make this more interesting. It's time for film theory! Boo! I'll get your own plan.
Way ahead of you, Badmouse. Light years and light years ahead of you.
In 2006, Will Smith told the story of Chris Garner, a black man who struggled through poverty, separation, and fatherhood whilst living in San Francisco. He gets an internship with a sales company, and despite having to put up with a lot, by the end of the film, he passes, and at this point, we're supposed to feel really happy and redeemed. But to those who've watched it, surely I'm not alone. Was it really a happy ending? I'll say I walked out of that viewing feeling very uncomfortable and sour. But why is that? Well, for starters, getting an internship, a 6-month unpaid internship mind, in one of the most expensive cities in America might have something to do with it. Then he's got to deal with his wife leaving him. Then he's got to take care of his son. Then he loses his only source of income. Then he's got to deal with eviction, sleeping rough, not sleeping at all. By the end of the movie, sure, he gets his redemption, but the message of when life gives you lemons, just keep getting pummeled with those lemons and never dare to ask why, ultimately seems kinda hollow. 6 months. 6 months of labour he and 19 other people, who did not make the cut, mind, that they are effectively giving away for free. And what about those other 19 people? Who ever tells their story? The way his superiors act like total dicks, pushing him around and getting him to be their lobby boy, they lost nothing. And now he's going to work for them. Is the new message here supposed to be, well, if this guy can survive the moon falling on him, what the hell are you complaining about? Actually, yeah. Yeah, I think consciously or not, this is what is being said. The extent of exploitation here is practically naked, yet in the way the movie is presented, I'm inclined to agree with this, and take it into my home, and sleep with it. Now, name me as many pieces of media that regurgitate this same old theme of rags to riches through adversity, to look at the man on center stage, yet pay no attention to the millions locked in a cage.
Okay, Badmouse, off the top of my head, let's run through a short list of movies where the protagonist ends up massively screwed over or dead. Waterworld, any of the Mad Max movies, Sort of a Stranger, I'd say between a quarter and a third of the anime movies I've watched. Hellsing, Hellsing Ultimate. I could go on here. If I really wanted to start digging and searching, I could probably find as many examples of movies where the protagonist ends up either with nothing to show for their effort or dead on the floor at the end of the movie. The entire Shakespearean catalog is the protagonist and nearly the entire cast dead at the end of the play. To argue there is a narrative here is to completely ignore huge chunks of the media which run counter to what you are trying to say, which I think more reflects your desire for a narrative than any relevant narrative occurring in entertainment media. But let's ignore all that. Let's just throw that out the window. Let's pretend, yes, there is absolutely a narrative going on. First of all, I have no reason to believe you're bucking it in any significant capacity. I mean, I walk into anarchist and communist forums and declare there are not enough jobs for everyone. There were never enough jobs for everyone because jobs are merely the production of commodities for people to consume, and human desire is not and has never been infinite, and I get banned from the forum for that. So honestly, I really don't see most of the leftist sphere actually bucking the narrative. If anything, you're reinforcing it. But you still have not demonstrated your moral authority to control the narrative versus the idea that control over the narrative is itself unjustified. All you've demonstrated is that your opponent is doing something. And we end up straight back to the question of, why should slaves be whipped at all? Why should anyone be slaves? Why should anyone be permitted to dictate what the narrative is or ought to be? You have not established this yet.
Sure, say it as you will, art is merely what you make of it, and there's not necessarily any devious agenda being pursued at all times. That's one perspective, I suppose. Another might be that there's no such thing as art for art's sake. It all gears itself towards differing political lines. In a society based upon private individual enterprise, it's really no surprise that art would also foster themes that would support society as the normal and natural, even if they appear on the surface as radical. Case in point, the idea of art for art's sake, but also the entire Hollywood catalogue. On the waterfront is literally McCarthyism on celluloid. The People vs. Larry Flint guises pornification and billionairedom into a story of libel and, you guessed it, freedom of speech. And ironically enough, probably the worst offender is, and yeah, I'm gonna lose some of you right now, Billy Elliot, the movie, in which 2/3 of the way through, Billy's dad strike breaks as a way to pay for his son to go to a prestigious art school. You know, rather than maybe having him stay and use those skills to improve, embolden, and enliven the downtrodden community, rather than leaving it to die. Jackie's very sympathetic in his devotion towards his son, except striking is caring for your family. You're fighting for a better future, together, as one. And that's just thrown away in favour of a much more individualistic, get out of your circumstances, go live your dream, and go replicate the same circumstances that made you poor in the first place.
Quick aside, I've never seen Billy Elliot. I have no information beyond what Badmouse has just given me. And frankly, I have little to no patience with film theory. It's the kind of thing I just do while watching the film, mostly out of boredom. But let's look at this at face value. I'm going to take everything he says straight up and assume this is what's going on. You have one movie championing an individual advancing at the expense of their entire community. Okay, cool. How many dozens and dozens and dozens of films, anime, cartoons, do you have lionizing that the entire group must work together or no one gets to stay alive? Off the top of my head, the Band of Brothers series, any war movie, well, not any war movie, quite a few war movies. 300, The Longest Day. Oh, good heavens, how many others? I've lost count. There are innumerable films and even more stories showcasing the idea that multiple people working together will always be stronger than a single individual working alone, and innumerable movies showcasing that a single individual working alone will be stronger than multiple people working together. It is precisely this debate that is what makes free speech so important. The two narratives competing will show to us what is right. I have my view of what is right. Badmouse has his view of what is right. But if communism means anything at all, then the great majority of people must be allowed to decide for themselves what is or is not right.
Can't you be a belly dancer here, like? Don't be stupid.
Now, I've read Lee Hall. I know that he didn't intend for any of this to come through, but he is no more aloof than any of us are. We're all susceptible to this common culture.
Would anyone else like to point out the error Badmouse is making here? Badmouse, if everyone is subject to the common culture, then you are also subject to the common culture. Whatever narrative you implement, whatever narrative you enforce, will still carry some portion or part of that common culture, no matter how radical you think it is. So, to abolish entirely the common culture, if that is your goal, you must allow people to step forward and say, excuse me, this narrative you are presenting still carries this portion or part of the previous common culture. It still has this little element within it, which they cannot do if they are not allowed to criticize whatever narrative you are trying to impose.
Just see the way our common culture infiltrates into how communism is talked about in 2015's Trumbo, the story of the Hollywood screenwriter who was blacklisted for 2 decades for being a member of the Communist Party. Could make for some groundbreaking stuff, right? Well, no. Instead, we're left with a film that focuses entirely upon freedom of expression. Ugh. Which is ironic because if they represented him truthfully, it would have resulted in a much more nuanced movie. Instead, all we get is this 2-minute scene talking about communist ethics, and God, it's done in the most sanitized and radical storybook tale way possible. It doesn't in any regard represent who the actual Dalton Trumbo was.
Share.
Share? Well, you don't tell them to just go get a job?
No.
Oh, you offer them a loan at 6%. Oh, that's very clever.
Well, the truth is that, Stalin was this horrible, vicious, ugly person. I'm no fan at all.
I think I have a case that profit incentives are steering the way in which media is presented. Yeah, sounds radical, right?
Or it could be that a group of people who don't particularly like communism did a hit piece disguised as a write-up. How do you not see this? I mean, the last time I checked, that actor is a very, very well-known libertarian. I could be wrong here. Maybe I'm thinking of the wrong person. I'm not even going to bother looking at the Wikipedia article for it. And he's the guy who did Malcolm in the Middle. He's the guy who did, what was the name of that series? Breaking Bad. I'm pretty sure I remember he's very, very libertarian. So it would not surprise me if he decided to do a movie presenting communism as this idea we talk about, but no one really needs to believe it. A movie saying, yes, it is horribly bad. This person was blacklisted for speaking their beliefs, but the beliefs themselves remain wrong. That is a perfectly consistent position for a libertarian to take. So no, am I surprised a libertarian took that position? Not in the slightest. Are there a number of movies I can probably go find if I felt like it, showcasing how well collective action works? Yeah, I probably could.
We live in a society where we have no problem pointing out the subtle propaganda messages in Soviet children's cartoons.
Зачем записывать? Мы уже все подружились.
Да-с, мы действительно подружились на стройке.
But reverse that onto our own society, prepare for some awkward stares. Now you may argue that none of what I've spoken about here has anything to do with censorship of free expression, and this is the problem. Our notions of censorship are stuck firmly behind the Berlin Wall, and that's far too simplistic, not to mention outdated. Just go watch the video I made. Undoubtedly, Coca-Cola has a far greater reach of expression than I will ever be able to ascertain. Who says then who will speak at a public forum, decide the content of a documentary, of a publication, of a movie, of a political campaign? If a book is blacklisted by all publishers for political reasons, what difference does it make having one publishing house or 100? If 90% of the movie market alone is controlled by just 7 companies, what kind of advice is just start your own business? If we want to talk about the free flow of expression and information, what little are these flyers when Zionism has a whole nation and 2 continents supporting it?
And yet, despite all of that money and all of that control, the majority of Israelis support a 2-state solution. Most Americans don't trust large corporations, and the majority of the American public desires to have a universal healthcare system. It's almost like none of the propaganda really matters, because sooner or later, people will figure out the truth, Badmouse.
This is the kind of expression we're dealing with today. Not the voices of individuals, but of multinationals. The fact that we had in any way an outpouring of sympathy towards one of these companies, Sony, for having their movie The Interview possibly censored by DPRK agents is a testament to how lost in the plot we have become.
You mean people have taken a moral position that considering all possible sides of a question is the best way to reach a conclusion, and silencing a particular side regardless of how wrong you might think they are is detrimental to the pursuit of the truth? Gee, Badmouse, it's almost like they understand the idea of why free speech is important.
And if by any chance media cannot direct the status quo by monopoly, it brings out its tried and tested method. I present to you Guerrero Heroico. This photograph was allowed such free spread not simply because it's bloody badass, but because there was no intellectual property designated upon it. By Corder's intention as a communist himself, he agreed with the free flow of art. But you and I both know what this resulted in at the behest of capitalist corporations. The pastiche of revolution, to be bought and sold many times over. Take any form of media, a word, an expression, it will be hoisted away, slapped on a shirt, and sold back to you at a handsome price. You cannot escape this. The moment that this becomes the new Shay, it loses all its power. Resistance is reduced to, at worst, LARPing, at best, nerd fandom. And the winners are the profiteers.
I mentioned earlier in the video a man named Jan Hus. Before I mentioned him, did you have any idea who he was? I'm perfectly sincere here. Think back for a second. Did you have to wiki his name to figure out who the fuck I was talking about? I'm willing to bet, yeah, you had no clue who that guy was. One of the most revolutionary leaders in Europe. Changed the entire course and direction of European history. And I guarantee you, you had no clue who he was. Why? If I walk up the street and ask a random person, who's Che Guevara, are they going to know? Are they going to have an idea who that guy is? If I ask them who Peter Kropotkin is, are they going to know? No, they aren't going to have a clue. It is precisely because Che Guevara's face is on a t-shirt that anyone remembers who he was at all. And that knowledge is the tool we can use to further our aims. To spread the idea, yes, communism can work. Yes, there were people who supported it and supported it heroically. And instead, because a handful of capitalists happen to make a few dollars off of this, you are going to take all of that and throw it away. Badmouse, you are a buffoon. You have no understanding of what the contradictions of capitalism even refer to because you have just blatantly ignored one of the central ones. Capitalism will spread its own destruction because it is profitable for individual actors to do so.
If profit is the aim of the game, then naturally, speech will be supported which nurtures the economy, not seeks to destroy it. Believe it or not, expression is not some flat line by which all societies are to be held accountable to. They are apparatuses held by those who dictate the power. That is why there is a necessity for us to control the narrative. Because if we don't, they're still going to.
And in case anyone thought I was strawmanning Badmouse, he goes and confirms the very thing I just said. Badmouse, have you ever watched the movie Too Big to Fail? Have you ever read anything about the run-up to the 2008 financial crisis? There were a dozen people saying, this is going to hit every single bank, it will hurt every single bank, and none of the people in the banks thought to say, hey, we should stop. Why do you think that is, Badmouse? Could it possibly be that the capitalists are focused on short-term profit with no regard for the long-term consequences of their own actions? This is one of the dichotomies of capitalism. Capitalists will do something which is objectively, empirically harmful to them in the long term and will not care. They will publish Che Guevara t-shirts advertising the existence of an alternative system that seeks only their destruction and think not a second about doing so. And in spite of this tendency, you continue to peddle the idea that if we simply remove the capacity of anyone to propound any narrative at all, the public will not eventually, quite quickly I would imagine, reach the conclusion that a system which considers the long-term consequences of actions is superior to a system that does not.
When armies with unequal numbers go into battle, a draw is a defeat for the lesser side.
And not only has Badmouse never studied any Marxism, he has never studied any revolutionary history either. The reason the American Revolution was successful was that despite being fought to a draw time and time and time again, the Revolutionary Army remained intact and eventually started winning battles. The reason the Civil War went on so long was that Lee consistently fought armies 3, 4, 5 times the size of his own to a draw. The reason a dozen revolutions throughout history were successful was that despite early draws and early defeats, the Revolutionary Army was able to retreat intact, reorganize, come back, and win. If you are able to fight a force multiple times the size of your own to a draw, run away intact, come back and fight again, that is not a defeat. That is a victory. I will point you simply to a single example at risk of committing the very fallacy I've accused you of. Read A Bright and Shining Lie. Read The Battle of Ap Bok, where the very first time the Vietnamese communists fought the military to a draw, every single U.S. commander, looking back upon that later, said, "Dear Christ God, we should have at that second sat up and taken notice."
Make believe it or not, but your radical centrist politics have their political leanings as well, even if just by effect. I like freedom of speech. I love it. I live on it. I'm a goddamn YouTuber, for Christ's sake. But I'm not stupid. I know what's coming. I know this ain't gonna last. I know that there are groups out there who would want to censor me if they could. And that's not some fault of human nature or the system. That's politics.
And yet you commit the most basic of all blunders. The idea that you and you alone will wield the weapon you pick up. This has never been true. Inevitably, in a conflict, when one side opens the door to a moral action, both sides end up using that action. The only guarantee of your speech is the guarantee of your opponent's.
You might say, all we're talking about is the legal sphere. Firstly, the legal is the social. Pure ideology to say otherwise. But second, it's difficult for you to call yourself a fighter for free speech when, as I've explained here, there's so much more to this than simply the judicial. Many proponents will even sidestep the judicial boundaries anyway when monopoly becomes involved. And if I have to explain how monopoly is not an externality of our system but an inherent part of accumulation, it's strange how we're usually all so skeptical about an economic free market. But when that free marketplace of ideas comes around, hey, it unlocks your inner libertarian. Jesus.
First, the legal is not the social. The existence of cannabis culture disproves this. Second of all, we do not have a monopoly on speech. I have already shown you the stats for this. I have already shown you, again, I repeat, the two-state solution is the most popular idea among Israelis, despite the fact that you have just flatly stated Zionism controls the media. Thirdly, if free markets actually functioned, existed in any meaningful form, I don't think we'd have a movement. It is precisely because of the contradictions in the ideal of a free market that free markets are an oxymoron, that they do not meaningfully exist, that they're a lie told to us, that we oppose the capitalist system. I don't know of a single person, no matter how far left, who, if markets functioned as advertised, would still oppose them. It is precisely because markets do not function as advertised that we oppose the system as it currently stands.
I'll tell you why I joined UKIP.
I'm going to be joining UKIP too.
And me.
It's when I see stuff like this that I begin wondering if it's all just a trend that will eventually die off when people realize the complexities of their circumstances. I remember how just a few years ago many libertarians were speaking the merits of free speech until they discovered that methodological individualism wasn't actually achieving their goals. I count down the days when Lauren Southern is going to finally call for limits on speech, just like her limits on borders. After all, freedom is not free, it must be defended. Right?
Yes, Badmouse, the supporters of the capitalist system are slowly realizing the contradictions inherent to that system. How are you not? How are you being so jaw-droppingly obtuse about the fact that this system is inherently unsustainable, doesn't work, and will inevitably fall apart?
This is a historic moment in political discourse. At this point, ultimately what we're interested in is picking sides. And you'll do this just as much as anybody else will.
Nope. I don't need to pick sides. I don't need to pick anything. I just told you If I sit on my thumbs and do nothing at all, the system will implode. I don't need a side. I need facts. I need evidence. I need patience. And that is all I need.
On my side of the fence, we like to talk a lot about left unity. I'm not necessarily against the idea, don't get me wrong, but a lot of the time people make a religion out of it, glossing over the fact that many aspects of various factions contradict one another. It might not be immediately obvious, but when push comes to shove, these conflicts become very apparent. There are some principles in which each side certainly does not see eye to eye. Politics is pervasive. Everything is political, and the choice to remain apolitical is usually just an endorsement of the status quo.
If there is one thing that has continually perplexed me about the social justice movement, it is their total ignorance of the concept of entropy. If you choose to do nothing, then inevitably, whatever your current condition, it will rot and collapse. If I choose not to repair my truck will break down. If I choose not to repair my house will fall apart. If you choose not to maintain the status quo, there will very shortly not be a status quo. Again, our greatest allies right now are the people who choose to spend all day sitting in their basement playing video games, because they are doing nothing. And without their support, the status quo will rot and crumble. This is why, historically, capitalists have excoriated non-workers, have done everything possible to shame and humiliate people who were not actively contributing, because they knew full well that without the active contribution of the laboring class, capitalism would implode. We don't need them to be there for us. We simply need them not to be there for the other side.
If it wasn't obvious by now, I'm a communist. I believe in the liberation of the people who do all of the work through armed struggle based upon their material circumstances. It is for this reason, as well as many others, that I am interested in real mass culture. Stuff that gets people interested in liberating themselves instead of just capitulating to markets all the time. It is also for this reason that I am not interested in the views of right-wing nationalists, fascists, reactionaries, my enemies, in other words. The views of which largely, in my opinion, regress society, and they're not interested in defending me either. Wouldn't expect them to. You can defend the middle ground as long as you like, but the fact of the matter is, you're gonna get flanked sooner or later. And your people are gonna desert you.
Have you never seen a video of the Nazi rallies in the 1930s? It is precisely mass culture that the National Socialists were obsessed with, because they understood that if they allowed no propaganda, everyone was going to realize what they were doing was fucked up and stupid.
But what about the thousands of other cases that did not enjoy the oxygen of publicity, that weren't quite ludicrous enough to attract media attention?
You might want to bump in when I denounce Dankula, stating his punishment showcases that the system is at fault. And I would agree. This system is at fault, kids. It's been at fault since our Constitution, yes, we do have one, was written. And it'll never stop being at fault until you solve these contradictions. Liberalism did fail. Its ideals never came to fruition, and that is the reason why the socialists now carry forward that praxis from which we can achieve what they set out to do. Sometimes that will involve using words. Sometimes that will involve using propaganda. Sometimes that will involve using lots and lots of guns. But believe me, you cannot always fight this war by playing nice, by playing principled. Sometimes you have to use a diversity of tactics, or you lose.
Again, I repeat, there is almost no instance in history where a weapon picked up by one side did not end up being wielded by both sides. World War I is the perfect example. There were multiple international laws banning the use of chemical weapons, and the instant Germany used them, out the door went all of that. The only reason the Japanese did not reply with nuclear weapons to the United States was that they had no capacity to build them. I assure you, sir, those we are fighting are fully capable of suppressing your speech.
Maybe what we need is 11 of them. But look, this is more of a material answer, and I know that most of you probably don't give a shit about some dead Chinese guy. So going back to the idea about having responsibility for our speech, the language, the words we use, well, here's my story.
I am going to let him finish the entirety of his story before I proceed with my own, because I want everyone to understand the point of comparison here.
If you were a straight white male aged 11 to 16 in the UK, then there's a good chance that you got picked on. Sometimes here and there, sometimes a lot, maybe every day. Not necessarily violence, that's really overstated in the media, no, but words from numerous mouths can be highly unnerving. I did not have a particularly happy-go-lucky adolescence. I hated it. Every day going to school was a struggle. It was a black smudge on my existence. I really don't actually understand why I bothered going in. I wasn't really getting very good grades anyway. And unlike some people, I didn't have a friend group that I could go off to, so I was all on my own. But on the weekends, I did get to go to drama club. And there, I would also get picked on. But looking back on it, it wasn't the same as it was in school. This wasn't spiteful, this was just friendly banter. But I didn't see it like that. So when I would tell my friends, please, don't do this, their response would be, well, we're just having a joke, We're just having fun. What's the big deal? Get over it. It's okay.
I generally avoid talking about this. First, because I don't enjoy it, and second, because in my experience, other people don't enjoy hearing about it. From the time I was in kindergarten almost straight through middle school, I attended a very violent school system. If the only thing people did was hurl insults at me, that was a good day. At least once a week, I climbed off the bus with fist-sized bruises, sometimes a couple, sometimes quite a few. And this was perfectly normal and routine. It's just roughhousing. It's not a big thing. Getting hit in the head with chunks of wood was perfectly normal. In 5th grade, I think I ended up unconscious in the nurse's office, bleeding from the top of my head half a dozen times. Because someone walked up and slammed a tree branch over my head. I have extremely little patience with what Badmouse is talking about that. Again, I repeat, if all I got was insults, that was a good day. I am very happy, Badmouse, that you had a social circle you could go to on weekends. By the time I hit 4th grade, the only thing I wanted to do on weekends was walk through the woods by myself, because I could not be asked to trust anyone my own age, out of fear that I would be physically attacked. So no, I really do not see, after ending up with multiple sets of stitches, several lost teeth, scars on the top of my head, how words were so horrible for you.
Now, I didn't really have a nerve back then. I'd been conditioned to just accept my lot. But if I could go back, I would say, actually, no, it's not okay. Because you don't know for the life of me what I've had to go through, what I've had to deal with. All the pain, all the humiliation. 5 days a week, 30 hours a week. Fucks you up. To you, this might just come across as friendly. To me, it doesn't. To me, it comes across like you're a psychopath who wants to get pleasure out of my pain and suffering. Now, the usual response to this would be, well, what do you expect me to do, huh? Treat you like a robot?
Beat you with sticks? Smash my face into your nose? Punch you repeatedly? Kick you in the balls, slam my elbow into the small of your back, and then kick you while you are curled up on the ground in a ball, writhing in pain? Oh, well, did none of that happen? Well, gee.
Huh? Just get over it. Leave it in the past. It's over now. You're just making it harder for everybody else. Or some other faux victimized response. And yeah, I mean, there's a grain of truth in that. I probably shouldn't have made worse of a bad situation. The fact of the matter is, it happened. I'm still hurt. To you, this is just friends having fun. To me, it's a threat.
At some juncture, I really need to go over with you what exactly constitutes a threat.
Now, today, you can say whatever the hell you want to me, okay? I seriously don't care. I am in a much better place right now, and I'm all the happier for it. However, in the 7 or 8 years that I've had to recover since those days, I still bear an enormous hangover from it all. It has affected my decisions in life, sometimes to a regrettable extent, sometimes to a dire extent. I nowadays feel as though I'm always a burden upon other people, and simultaneously very, very distrustful of everybody. I never really want to hang around too much for fear that I'm just taking up the space. I never want to take chances in a friendship for fear I'll just humiliate myself again.
Badmouse, you call yourself a communist, yet have demonstrated in your total lack of comprehension of some of the most basic premises of Marxism. You don't seem to understand what the contradictions of capitalism even are. You don't recognize them when they're shown to you. You don't understand that the problem with markets isn't how they are propounded to function, it's the discrepancy between their actual function and their advertised function. And you don't seem to comprehend that people in a position of authority will have far more ability to suppress your speech than you have to suppress theirs. I think your concerns about embarrassing yourself might actually be fairly well founded. I don't like saying this, but I really need to be honest with you here. That might not be something you're making up. You might actually have a rather large amount of studying you need to go do.
It's been real hard to control my emotions. That's something I still, to this day, try to improve upon. And it's something that I really, really am not happy with and I am ashamed of, but I still name search myself all the time. I fucking hate it, but I'm terrified about what people think about me. And you know the reason why? You know the reason why people do this? It's because when I was in school, I would sometimes look around and I would catch someone looking at me, staring me straight in the eyes, and they were whispering something to someone else, and they were going, and I would always wonder, what are they talking about? Why are they laughing? Are they laughing at me? Are they not at all? Are they just having a conversation with themselves? And then I would look around and I would see someone else doing the same. And I would think back to something else that happened earlier that day, and I thought, well, are they talking about that? What's this all about?
This is one of the things that continually perplexes me about the modern social justice movement. Now, I've already told you my history, and to be honest, by third or fourth grade, I didn't give a fuck what anyone thought about me. I couldn't have cared less. Like I said, if all they were going to do was whisper in the corner, I was counting my blessings. But the modern social justice movement seems to be absolutely and utterly fixated on social status, and I don't get why. One of the central premises in my communism is, if I am guaranteed shelter, food, and clothing, I no longer need to care what other people's opinion of me is. One of the reasons I have to value social opinion is if I am anathema, if I am reviled by everyone, if I am cast out of society, I may very well freeze and starve. Conversely, if I am guaranteed to never freeze and starve, no matter what I do, I have zero reason to value the opinions of others, as long as I'm not going to end up incarcerated for anything. If every store owner is required to sell me food regardless of whether I walk in with shoes and a shirt or not, I probably would never wear shoes or a shirt in summer ever again. But the fuck do I care? You've got to sell me food anyway. I have a right to it. So why this obsession? Why this fixation with what others think, if the end goal of what we are doing guarantees to you absolutely your subsistence regardless of what anyone thinks of you? Where is this coming from? I honestly don't understand it at all.
That happened every day. Every fucking day. And it doesn't just go away. It doesn't. It stays with you. 5 years. 5 years of that I had to deal with. Those were the worst years of my life. And I have to live with it. I have to live with those stolen years of my life. Now, you might be wondering what the hell is the point of this story.
Actually, no. No, I'm really not wondering at all.
Well, Occidents are sometimes surprised that instead of buying their wife a fancy dress, the colonized instead buy a transistor radio. They shouldn't be. The colonized are convinced that their fate is in the balance. They live in the doomsday scenario and nothing must elude them. That's from The Wretched of the Earth by Franz Fanon. Now, I want you to take the experiences that I received as a child, relatively minor by comparison, and put them into the lives of other groups that exist today.
Yes, let's tie your relatively minor experiences to the experience of people who have actually suffered meaningful violence. I can't possibly imagine how this is going to completely distort the argument.
Victims of domestic violence, the colonized, victims of racism, sexism, queerphobia. Like I said, I have escaped that situation for it. I'm happier now. But they're not. Some people still live in the scenario where they feel their fate is in the balance. And they're just crying out all the time, please don't do that, it hurts. Please don't say that.
A protest they would not be able to make if they were not able to speak Badmouse.
And it all falls on deaf ears. Myself included. Yeah. But it's not okay. But I would like to think from experience in my life that we can fix this. My solution to this is simple. Freedom of speech is not just some phrase you can throw around to score political points. It doesn't materialize simply because we think it should. If we really do want what the old boys always spoke about, then we need to be prepared to break a few eggs to make an omelette. We need to be sure that the conditions in society are such that no longer proliferate ideas that would lead to the downfall of said society.
Ideas like communism, Badmouse? Ideas like the overthrow of the capitalist system? Ideas like revolutionary action against the existing social order, the existing economic order, the existing political order? How the fuck can anyone be this obtuse? I mean, you are literally repeating the rationalizations that got the early abolitionists shot and their presses thrown in the river. The rationalizations used by the Russian government of the Tsars to suppress every single democratic and socialist movement in the history of Russia, in the history of Austria-Hungary, in the history of Germany and France and Britain and Italy and every single other place that they rose up. And you are cheering the entire time as if this is some brilliant innovation you just came up with. You absolute and utter buffoon. You are right now placing your personal feelings ahead of the entire future of our movement, and you don't even care.
You may think I'm being idealist when I say this, but I'm not. This tattoo of mine would have 90 years ago be considered anti-communist as hell, but has now become a pan-left symbol against fascism. It is living proof that these ideas, these symbols, these words, they change. They can be resolved. When class struggle subsides, when the divides between different groups are such that nobody feels like their fate is in the balance, then maybe we could get into a comedy show, stand on center stage, and proudly proclaim, yeah, let's talk about those and receive rounding applause from all sides. Maybe. But until then, don't be a dick.
In this, we completely agree. Badmouse, please stop being a dick.